continue with another topic, with craft topic, and also I will move another area. Today I'll speak about changes in rural textile craft in the end of the 16th century on the basis of Estonian finds. First, for the background, I just introduce shortly the chronology, Estonian chronology, and the background information about history. The medieval period starts with early 13th century with crusades and Christianization. This transition, the conquest and Christianization, caused the integration of Estonia into the political, social, and also religious structures of Western Europe. Traditionally, the middle of the 16th century or the end of the 16th century is regarded as the borderline between the Middle Ages and the post-medieval period in Estonia. And this borderline is marked with the devastating Livonian War that started in 1558. And this caused the establishment of new political and economic system again. The 16th century itself can be regarded as a transitional period from medieval to the post-medieval period. Maybe we can also say that from the religious society of the Middle Ages to the more secularized world of post-medieval states. And in the first decades of 16th century, there appeared several tendencies that clearly reflects changes in both mental and physical environment. For example, Reformation or changing political and economic conditions. First, speaking about textile craft, I would like to introduce the tradition that dominated before so-called Great Change. Despite of enormous changes that crusades and Christianization caused to the society in the early 13th century, it seems that the domestic rural craft did not change much, at least the textile craft, and it remained firmly based on previous traditions established already in prehistory. The tools and techniques known already from late Iron Age were used throughout the medieval period in rural areas. For example, as a raw material, wool of local double-coated sheep was used. It was prepared for spinning using combs or just hands. Yarn was spun with spinning whorl. On the basis of found textile remains, vertical looms were used for weaving. It means that the warps were hanging from up to down. And for example, a costume from Paris-Selja Poog that, according to the C14, dates really from the 16th century, illustrates well this maintenance of the old tradition. The cut of the kirtle is very simple and universal. The cloth has been woven on warp-weighted loom. I don't really probably introduce the details, but it's based, this assumption is based on the technical details of fabric, such as selvages and weave types or weaving errors. And to conclude that old tradition, I can say that making cloth in medieval villages was probably a domestic handicraft, mainly carried out by women in order to satisfy the needs of one's own family. And daughters were learned skills from their mothers or grandmothers, and the craft system was satisfying the needs, so it wasn't really need to adopt new skills or knowledge or tools, and maybe this was also one reason that the tradition maintained so long unchanged. And parallel to this rural tradition, also another tradition existed in the area. In the 13th century, after the Crusades, first towns were established by Germans in the territory of present-day Estonia, And also new textile types and techniques common to other parts of Europe were introduced here quite quickly. For example, foot-operated horizontal loom or maybe spinning wheel. We don't know exactly, but it seems that the textile culture in urban environment was similar to other Western European towns. And handicraft in towns was subjected to guild rules. The professional weavers were often men. They were oriented to production of standardized cloth for trade and market. And obviously, it seems that there were no connections between this rural household production and professional urban production models. They just existed parallel. But then something happened, and clear change in the rural textile production becomes visible on the basis of archaeological material, at least at the very end of the 16th century. Or even by the beginning of the 17th century, but maybe it started already earlier. I mean, it's visible on the basis of archaeological material. For example, it is well visible in the study on plant fiber textiles found in Estonia. The majority of the analyzed fragments are tabbies. And within this large tabby group, two fabric subtypes can be distinguished. First, tabby cloth with rep character. It means I don't know, I'm not able to use that at the moment. It means that one system is remarkably more densely placed. You can see on the picture above, it's one system, warp and weft, is covering another one almost entirely. And another subtype is balanced tabby. It means that the threads, warp and weft yarns are equally based, so they are nicely visible and equal. And it's quite clear that until the end of the 16th century, mainly remains of rep weaves have been discovered. And it was definitely the standard type of cloth for peasants in medieval period. But by the beginning of the 17th century, the ratio has clearly changed. And first, the balanced tabby group ratio becomes significantly higher than the rep weaves. And another trend is that since the 17th century, more samples of different weaves, different than tabby, and also decorated weaves, so decorations woven into the fabric have been found. So, and this change can be explained by the transformation of the technological process. And for example, I think it may mark the spread of new loom type in rural areas, horizontal foot-operated loom. In comparison with warp-weighted loom, in the case of horizontal loom, the warp is tensioned horizontally, and the reed, this is the comb-like tool on I don't know if it's visible here. It helps to control the warp yarns more correctly. It means that it separates the warp threads and holds them in their correct positions. This certainly affected and changed the placement of threads in weave. The threads are placed more evenly, and it's more convenient to weave balanced tabby. The chain operatoire of textile production is not one integrated whole, so it means that changing one step affects also others. Also in rural textile craft, several steps of textile production process altered more or less contemporaneously at the same time. For example, looms with higher productivity required more productive yarn preparation. And it seems that also spinning wheel and wool cards were introduced almost in the same time. Just a few examples. And of course, I want to stress that this transition, it wasn't a sudden break. The end of the 16th century was the beginning of a longer process, and it seems that the process had ended by the beginning of the 18th century. So it's clearly visible in another bog find. This is just one example again, dated to the end of the 17th century or even in the beginning of the 18th century. It shows clearly that transition had ended. It's horizontal. The fabrics have been woven on horizontal looms, and knitting was spread, and the cut is really complicated already. And we have exact parallels among ethnographic material already. It's a new era in comparison with the other bog find I showed before. And why this change happened, and why it happened at the end of the 16th century, because in urban craft it happened, the same change happened already in the 13th century. And I think the main reason, just to conclude very briefly, the main reason could be in the changing economic systems, and the urban tradition was mediated via manors and manor craft, because it's the precondition for this change could be following. It is known from written sources that the number of manors increased during the 16th century, and really a denser network of manors was established. And by the 16th century, the manors also had developed an agricultural system that was heavily oriented to the external markets, and the main export article was crop, for example. So, and also somehow it affected probably the rural communities living countryside. And definitely more people were living in manors, and among others also since 16th century we have information about professional craft persons living in manors. And for example, most numerous are weavers. So it was really something that probably affected rural communities, because especially in 17th century there are many weavers living countryside and working in manors. But maybe this was not the only reason, and I think that this transformation may indicate also wider changes in the society. The medieval rural societies or village communities were maybe it somehow closed and relied on traditions, but something changed, and they were at the end of the 16th century or in the 17th century they were more open and ready to accept new things. It's probably I'm not able to evaluate the influence of Reformation or changing political conditions, or for example this war and plagues, and 16th century actually was really harsh, and also demographically I think 1/3 was alive in the beginning of the 17th century in comparison with the beginning of the 16th century, so big changes happened. But I think that the main reason was more close contacts between village peasants and manor craft persons. Thank you.